A boy is crying in the dirt outside a cave. Three others stand over him, grinning, one of them still pointing mid-insult. It's not a fight. Nobody's swinging a fist. It's something quieter and, in its own way, meaner. Three people who've decided, together, that this one person is the joke for the day. If you think that scene belongs only to a modern schoolyard, you're wrong. Something very close to it was almost certainly playing out in bands of humans tens of thousands of years before anyone built the first schoolyard, and the reasons why are stranger than you'd expect. Here's the paradox worth sitting with for a second. Anthropologists who study hunter-gatherer societies, both ancient ones through indirect evidence and living ones through direct observation, almost universally describe these groups as fiercely egalitarian. No permanent chiefs, no kings, no one person telling everyone else what to do. Food gets shared. Decisions get made by consensus or something close to it. On paper, this sounds like the opposite of a bullying culture. So where does a crying kid getting mocked by three other people fit into a society that prides itself on equality? The answer is that equality among hunter-gatherers wasn't a peaceful default state. It was a constant, active project, and the tool used to maintain it was social pressure sharp enough to leave scars that never show up on a skeleton. Let's start with the term anthropologists actually use for this: leveling mechanisms. The anthropologist Christopher Bohm spent decades studying how small-scale societies prevent any one person from accumulating too much power, and what he found was that these groups don't wait around hoping nobody gets too big for their boots. They actively tear down anyone who tries. The clearest documented example comes from the Juhuanci people of the Kalahari, studied extensively by Richard Lee, starting in the 1960s. Lee once brought a large ox to a Juhuanci camp as a gift, expecting gratitude. Instead, the group spent the whole visit mocking the animal. Too skinny, barely worth the trouble of killing. Not enough meat on those bones to feed a child, let alone a camp. Lee was baffled until an older man explained it to him plainly. When a young man kills meat, he comes to think he's a chief or a big man, and he thinks of the rest of us as his servants or inferiors. We can't accept this, so we always speak of his meat as worthless. This way, we cool his heart and make him gentle. That's not politeness. That's organized, deliberate insult aimed directly at the person who did something impressive, specifically to keep his ego in check. Anthropologists have a blunter name for it: insulting the meat, and it wasn't reserved for special occasions. It was routine. Good hunters got mocked constantly, precisely because they were good hunters. Now stretch that principle back tens of thousands of years, because there's no reason to think it started with the Juhuanci. The behavior shows up independently across unrelated hunter-gatherer cultures on different continents. The Hadza of Tanzania, various Aboriginal Australian groups, Inuit communities in the Arctic, which is exactly the kind of pattern anthropologists look for when trying to figure out what's ancient versus what's a local invention. When the same social technology appears in isolated populations that never had contact with each other, it's a strong sign the behavior is old. Possibly as old as cooperative hunting itself. Not every ancient teasing custom was hostile, though, and it's worth pausing on that, because otherwise this starts to sound like every prehistoric campfire was a non-stop roast. Several hunter-gatherer and small-scale farming societies developed something anthropologists call a joking relationship, a formal, almost ritualized permission for specific pairs of relatives, often cousins or in-laws, to mock each other constantly without either side taking real offense. Among the Aka people of Central Africa and in various Inuit communities, certain kin were expected to trade insults as a normal part of the relationship, a sanctioned outlet that let real tension get vented in a controlled, non-escalating way. Think of it as a pressure valve built directly into the social structure, a difference between family members who insult you because it's an old joke everyone's in on, and a group that's decided, without your consent, that you're the one they get to laugh at. Ancient people clearly understood the difference too, even if nobody wrote it down as a rule. So one whole category of ancient bullying wasn't aimed at the weak. It was aimed at anyone who got too strong. Call it upward leveling. The moment someone showed signs of wanting authority over others, the group turned on them with teasing, mockery, and social exclusion until the message landed. Bohm calls this a reverse dominance hierarchy, and it's a genuinely clever piece of social engineering. Instead of letting one alpha personality dominate everyone else, which is roughly what happens in chimpanzee troops, human groups flipped the script. The many dominate the one who tries to dominate. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because leveling mechanisms weren't the only kind of social pressure floating around ancient camps, and not every target was an ambitious young hunter who needed his ego trimmed. There's a second, darker category, one aimed downward instead of upward, targeting people for being different, weaker, slower, or simply unlucky. This kind of bullying leaves a much fainter trail in the archaeological record, and researchers have to work harder to piece it together, mostly through skeletal evidence and comparison with living small-scale societies. Skeletal remains from various prehistoric sites show healed fractures and blunt trauma concentrated in specific individuals rather than spread evenly across a population, patterns that don't match hunting accidents or warfare. Some researchers interpret clusters like this as evidence of repeated targeted violence within a group, not conflict with outsiders. It's difficult to prove definitively that a set of old, healed injuries came from bullying specifically rather than some other cause, and honestly, most archaeologists are careful about overclaiming here. But the pattern, several old injuries on the same person, healed at different times, inflicted by blunt objects rather than the kind of trauma you'd expect from an animal attack or a fall, is exactly what you'd expect from a person who got picked on repeatedly over a long stretch of time. It's worth being fair to ancient humans here too, because the record isn't uniformly bleak. Skeletal remains also show clear evidence of long-term care for people who couldn't have survived on cruelty and exclusion alone. A Neanderthal skeleton found at Shanidar Cave in Iraq belonged to an individual who lived for years with a withered arm, hearing loss, and significant mobility problems. Conditions that would have made him essentially useless for hunting, yet he survived into middle age, which only happens if a group actively supports someone who can't fully support themselves. A skeleton from Romito Cave in Italy, showing a form of dwarfism, likewise belonged to a person who lived to adulthood in a Paleolithic community, well past the point where neglect would have ended things early. So exclusion and cruelty were clearly real options on the table, but they weren't the only option, and plenty of ancient groups apparently chose differently when it came to members who couldn't keep up. Children specifically show up as a vulnerable category in ethnographic accounts of surviving hunter-gatherer bands. Kids who were physically smaller, slower learners of essential skills, or who simply looked different could become the target of teasing that ranged from good-natured ribbing to something closer to what we'd now flatly call bullying. In several documented societies, children who struggled to keep up during skill training, tracking, throwing, fire making, whatever the local survival curriculum happened to be, were mocked by their peers in ways adults sometimes stepped in to stop and sometimes didn't. And this is where ostracism enters the picture, because in a hunter-gatherer band, exclusion wasn't just socially unpleasant. It was close to a death sentence. Modern life lets you survive being unpopular. You can eat, sleep, and stay alive, whether or not anyone likes you. That was not true for most of human history. A person cut off from their group, even temporarily, lost access to shared food, protection from predators, help during illness, and the accumulated knowledge that kept everyone alive. Being pushed to the edge of the group wasn't a metaphor. It often meant literally being pushed to the edge of the camp, eating scraps, sleeping apart, treated as barely present. In the harshest cases, prolonged ostracism from a hunter-gatherer band could genuinely kill you, not through violence but through slow exposure, starvation, or simply being alone when something went wrong. This is almost certainly why exclusion became such a devastatingly effective social weapon, and why it still works on us today in ways that go far beyond hurt feelings. Researchers studying social pain in modern humans have found that the brain processes social rejection using some of the same neural circuitry it uses for physical pain. In a well-known study led by the psychologist Naomi Eisenberger, participants played a simple ball-tossing game while inside a brain scanner, only to be quietly excluded partway through as the other players stopped throwing to them. Brain activity during that exclusion lit up in regions closely associated with the distress of physical injury. Being left out doesn't just feel bad in some vague emotional sense. Parts of your brain respond to it the way they'd respond to a scraped knee. That overlap didn't appear by accident. It's a leftover from a very long stretch of human history where getting excluded from the group really was a threat to your survival, on the same level as an actual injury. So, evolution wired the alarm systems to overlap, which, frankly, feels like a raw deal. You'd think evolution could have found a gentler way to teach us to value friendship than making rejection feel like a physical wound. But apparently, subtlety wasn't on the menu 40,000 years ago. Which brings us back to that crying kid in the dirt. Picture a small band, maybe 25 to 30 people, living together for years, sometimes their whole lives. Everyone knows everyone. There's no new school to transfer to, no different town to move away to escape a reputation. If you got singled out as the weak one, the slow one, the odd one, in a group that size, that label could follow you for years because there was nowhere else to go, and no fresh start waiting around the corner. Some anthropologists argue this created intense pressure on children specifically to learn social calibration early and fast. Kids in small-scale societies often start participating in group activities, tracking, gathering, tool practice, well before modern kids start kindergarten, and the social stakes of fitting in were correspondingly higher. Mess up too often, seem too different, and the same social correction mechanisms used on power-hungry adults, mockery, exclusion, public embarrassment, could get turned on a child who simply couldn't keep pace yet. Formal initiation practices documented across a wide range of small-scale societies add another layer to this. Rites of passage marking the transition from childhood to adulthood frequently involved deliberate hardship, physical tests, fasting, isolation from the group for a set period, ritual scarification, tasks designed to be difficult enough that failure was a real possibility. Anthropologists studying these customs generally interpret them as serving a genuine social function, binding a young person more tightly to group identity, marking status clearly so nobody's position is ambiguous, building resilience needed for adult survival. But there's a blurry line between a structured test everyone in the group agreed to and endures together, and a repeated informal singling out of one person for abuse dressed up as tradition. Some documented initiation customs sit closer to the second category than anthropologists are always comfortable admitting, particularly when older members of the group seem to take a little too much enjoyment in administering the test. There's also a genuinely strange wrinkle here worth sitting with. The same tool that kept ambitious adults in check, group mockery, could just as easily be misapplied against someone who'd done nothing wrong except be born a little different. A leveling mechanism designed to stop the strong from dominating the weak has no built-in safeguard against the group deciding, for whatever petty or arbitrary reason, that the weak deserve mockery too. Social pressure is a blunt instrument. It doesn't automatically know the difference between an arrogant hunter who needs humbling and a scared kid who just needs a little patience. Resource scarcity made this considerably worse. During famine, drought, or a stretch of bad hunting, ethnographic records from a range of small-scale societies show a troubling pattern. Blame starts looking for somewhere to land. In several documented cases from parts of southern Africa to hunter-gatherer groups studied in South America, hardship periods coincided with accusations against specific individuals. Someone cursed the hunt, someone's bad luck is dragging the group down, someone didn't pull their weight, and now everyone's hungry because of it. The accused were frequently people who were already on the margins. Older members no longer able to keep pace. Children who'd underperformed. Anyone slightly unusual in appearance or behavior. When a group is frightened and hungry, it apparently doesn't take much to turn simple difference into a convenient explanation for misfortune, and the person singled out often ends up further isolated right when they can least afford it. So why does this matter now? Beyond satisfying curiosity about how mean people were 40,000 years ago, because the psychological wiring built by hundreds of thousands of years of small, tightly bonded groups didn't get an update when humans started living in cities of millions of strangers. The part of your brain that lights up when you're excluded from a group chat is running software that was originally built for a world where exclusion could kill you. That's not an excuse for modern bullying, and it's not meant to romanticize ancient social pressure either. Leveling mechanisms weren't gentle, and they weren't always fair. But understanding where this wiring came from helps explain why social rejection still hits so much harder than it logically should. Why a single unkind comment can sit in your memory for decades, and why humans across every culture, ancient and modern, seem to care so intensely about their standing within the group. It's also worth being honest about the limits of what we actually know here. We don't have video footage of a Paleolithic kid getting mocked by his friends. We can't interview anyone who lived through it. What we have is a patchwork, skeletal patterns that suggest repeated targeted violence, ethnographic records from living or recently living hunter-gatherer societies that show clear, well-documented leveling and teasing behaviors, and a deep, cross-cultural consistency in how humans respond to social exclusion at a neurological level. Put those three threads together, and you get a strong, reasonable inference. Not an ironclad fact. Anthropologists studying this stuff tend to hold their conclusions a little loosely, because the alternative, pretending we know exactly what happened around a specific fire 40,000 years ago, would be dishonest. What does seem solid is this. Bullying, in some recognizable form, is probably not a modern invention or a byproduct of crowded schools and social media. It looks a lot more like a very old feature of human group life, one that occasionally targeted the powerful to keep them humble, and other times, less fairly, targeted the vulnerable simply because they were an easy mark. The tools have changed. Group chats and hallway whispers instead of mocked hunts and camp gossip. But the underlying mechanism, using social pain to police who belongs and who doesn't, appears to be something we've been running on for a very long time. Next time someone tells you kids have always been cruel to each other, they might be closer to the truth than they realize, and further back in time than they'd guess.